There are moments in motorsport history that transcend statistics, championships, and even victories themselves. Moments that become legends not because of what happened on paper, but because of the sheer human will behind them. One such moment happened on a hot afternoon in Sao Paulo, Brazil, during the 1991 Brazilian Grand Prix at Autódromo José Carlos Pace. For years, Brazilian fans had watched their national hero come close to victory on home soil, only to see fate take it away. Mechanical failures, strategic misfortune, and the unpredictable nature of Formula One had denied him again and again. Yet on that day, against overwhelming odds, Ayrton Senna delivered one of the most heroic performances the sport has ever seen. It was not just a race victory, it was a physical battle between man and machine. By the final laps, Senna was driving with only a single functioning gear, fighting a car that seemed determined to stop. His body was exhausted, his hands were barely able to hold the steering wheel, and the gearbox threatened to fail at any moment. But somehow, through sheer determination, he crossed the finish line first. What happened that day would forever change the way the world viewed Ayrton Senna. The pressure of racing at home. For most drivers in Formula One, racing at home can be a privilege. For Ayrton Senna, it was something far more intense. Brazil, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, lived and breathed motorsport. Since the days of Emerson Fittipaldi and Nelson Piquet, Formula One had become a source of national pride. But by the time Senna arrived at the peak of his career, expectations had reached another level entirely. Every year when the Formula One circus arrived in Sao Paulo, millions of Brazilians expected one thing: victory. But despite being one of the fastest drivers on the grid and already a world champion, Senna had never managed to win his home Grand Prix. Mechanical failures had ruined his chances multiple times. In 1989 and 1990, victory seemed possible, but fate intervened. By the time the 1991 season began, Senna was already a two-time world champion driving for McLaren. He was widely considered the fastest driver in the world. Yet the Brazilian Grand Prix remained unfinished business, and Senna knew it. The start of the race. On race day, the atmosphere at Interlagos was electric. More than 100,000 fans packed the grandstands, waving Brazilian flags and chanting Senna's name. When the lights went out, Senna made a perfect start and immediately began building a gap at the front. The McLaren was competitive, and Senna drove with the precision that had made him famous throughout the Formula One world. Lap after lap, he pushed the car to its limit, gradually increasing the distance between himself and the chasing pack. Behind him were some of the strongest drivers of the era, including Riccardo Patrese and other experienced competitors who were ready to capitalize on any mistake. But for much of the race, Senna looked untouchable. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Until it wasn't. The beginning of the problem. With only a handful of laps remaining, Senna suddenly noticed something unusual in the gearbox. Shifting between gears began to feel inconsistent. The mechanical feedback through the gear lever changed. What had once been smooth and precise suddenly became unpredictable. At first, Senna assumed it was a minor issue, but within moments the situation escalated dramatically. The gearbox began to fail. One gear disappeared, then another. Each time Senna tried to shift, the transmission responded with increasing resistance. Eventually, the car became stuck in sixth gear, the highest gear available in the car. Driving a Formula One car in sixth gear around a circuit like Interlagos is nearly impossible. The car loses acceleration out of corners, forcing the driver to manage speed and engine torque with extreme care. But Senna had no choice. If he slowed down too much, he would lose the lead. If he pushed too hard, the gearbox might completely fail. The race had suddenly become a delicate balancing act between survival and speed. The final laps. As the race entered its final phase, the gap between Senna and the chasing cars began to shrink. Behind him, Riccardo Patrese sensed an opportunity. Patrese began closing the distance, lap by lap, as Senna struggled with a car that could no longer properly respond to his commands. Every corner required careful throttle control. Every straight demanded patience. Inside the cockpit, Senna was no longer simply racing his rivals. He was wrestling the car itself. Without proper gear changes, the McLaren's engine produced violent vibrations. The steering became heavier, and Senna's arms began to suffer from intense fatigue. Formula One cars of that era had no power steering. Every movement required physical strength, and as the gearbox malfunction worsened, the stress on Senna's body increased dramatically. By the final laps, the pain was becoming unbearable. A physical battle. What many fans watching on television did not realize was that Senna was reaching the limits of physical endurance. Driving with a stuck gear meant constantly fighting the engine's power delivery. The car jerked violently under acceleration, and Senna had to compensate with precise steering inputs to maintain control. Inside the cockpit, temperatures soared. The Brazilian heat added another layer of difficulty. Sweat poured down Senna's face, and his muscles began to cramp from the relentless effort required to keep the car on track. At one point, Senna later admitted he feared he might pass out before the race ended. But stopping was not an option. Not in Brazil, not in front of his people. The final lap. As the white flag waved, signaling the final lap, the entire circuit seemed to hold its breath. Fans knew something was wrong with Senna's car. They could see how slowly he was exiting corners. They could see Patrese closing the gap. Every Brazilian watching feared the same outcome they had witnessed so many times before, another heartbreak at Interlagos. But somehow Senna managed to keep the car moving. He guided the wounded McLaren through the final corners of the circuit, carefully controlling the throttle and praying the gearbox would survive just a little longer. Then finally, the finish line appeared. Victory at last. When Ayrton Senna crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted. After years of frustration and disappointment, Brazil finally had its moment. Senna had won the Brazilian Grand Prix. But inside the car, the situation was critical. Senna's arms were locked in painful cramps. His body had endured such extreme stress that he could barely move. When he finally stopped the car after the race, he struggled to exit the cockpit. Track marshals had to help him climb out. On the podium, the physical toll of the race became visible to the entire world. The iconic podium moment. As the Brazilian national anthem began to play, Senna lifted the trophy above his head. But even this simple act was incredibly difficult. His arms trembled violently from exhaustion. The muscles in his shoulders and hands had nearly seized completely. Yet despite the pain, Senna raised the trophy anyway. The image of him holding that trophy, surrounded by thousands of cheering fans, would become one of the most iconic moments in Formula One history. It was not just a victory, it was a symbol of determination, resilience, and the extraordinary mental strength that defined Ayrton Senna. Why this race became legendary. Over the years, Formula One has seen countless great races. Drivers have achieved incredible victories, dramatic comebacks, and unforgettable performances. But what happened at the 1991 Brazilian Grand Prix stands apart. Senna did not win because he had the fastest car. He did not win because everything went according to plan. He won because he refused to surrender. With a failing gearbox, unbearable physical pain, and relentless pressure from behind, he somehow managed to bring the car home in first place. It was the kind of performance that reminds us why motorsport is not only about machines, but about the people who drive them. Legacy. Today, decades later, that race is still remembered as one of the greatest drives in Formula One history. For Brazilian fans, it represents the ultimate example of Senna's connection with his country. For motorsport enthusiasts around the world, it represents something even bigger. The moment when a driver pushed beyond the limits of what seemed physically possible. Ayrton Senna had already proven he was one of the fastest drivers in the world, but on that day in Sao Paulo, he proved something far more powerful. He proved that sometimes determination alone can carry a driver across the finish line.